Thomas. How you doing?
Steve, good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good. It's good to meet you. How's everything coming along?
Pretty well. Yeah, just in general, everything's great. Really
Fantastic.
happy to be here and meeting you.
Yeah, of course. It's great to meet you too. What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now? How can I best support you?
Um, so I think really what it comes down to is being able to like effectively approach the question in like a rational way. I know that's sort of like a really broad generalization, but sometimes I'll overcompensate with like technical or fundamental analysis, and I'll sort of overlook the simplicity of the question when I could have just, intuitively looked at it and said, oh, yeah, of course, X is the correct answer. But sort of being bogged down by uh, the fundamental analysis of logical reasoning.
Gotcha. Okay. Are there certain questions where you notice this happening more than others?
Um, I would say sometimes sufficient and mostly sufficient questions. Um, I find myself sort of lost in connecting the abstract elements. Um, like for example, like C, like one of the well, I won't give a specific example because I don't know if I can come up with one off the top of my head, but essentially just sufficient assumption questions will confuse me.
Gotcha. Okay. So we're talking in the logical reasoning context here, overthinking easy questions, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things are noting that there's a certain order of difficulty in the logical reasoning section. So the first 10 or so questions, you don't have a lot of difficult ones there. There's very few level 4, level 5 questions, if any, in the first 10. So those are questions I would take them at their face value. And just note that going off the bat. Like those are not meant to separate people at the 160s from those in the 170s. They're meant primarily to separate those in the 120s and 130s from everybody else. That's overall. But then for sufficient assumption questions specifically, it can be useful to notice and to be aware of the different major formats these questions follow. There are certain underlying formulas to sufficient assumption questions in particular. And I lay these out in my sufficient assumption workshop, by the way. Have you watched that one?
I actually have. I've really done a deep dive into
Awesome.
all your categories already.
Great. So you know then that's great. So notice then that there's one major category of sufficient assumptions that's simply a restatement or broadening of the argument itself.
Yeah, those I'm typically fine with, but it's the one where you have to guarantee the conclusion by showing that like C requires or C requires A, and then A requires B. I sort of get lost in just the vocabulary and the way that the stimulus is typically laid out. That I almost panic, and then I see a choice that looks attractive, and I'm like, wait a second, no, that shouldn't be right. And then I'm like, wait, are they trying to trick me with this answer? And then it sort of just snowballs, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go with this one. I'll be between two, and that's when I'll really fall. So
gotcha. Okay, so yeah, that could be tough then, because if you panic and then just pick something that looks good, oftentimes what looks good is the reversal of the answer, or a slight tweak on what could be correct, but that tweak makes it wrong. And LSAC is very good at making wrong answer choices that are tempting. So what have you ever tried working through sufficient assumption questions by what type of sufficient assumption question they are?
I have never done that.
It could be useful for you. I have a categorization like that I can send you after this call.
Okay, actually, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so I've been studying for like a while, and what actually really drew me to your service was that I feel like you and I had like a parallel experience where you said, you were just putting your all into like just studying the LSAT as the LSAT and not really prioritizing the fundamentals. And I was like, yeah, that's sort of what I'm doing. I'm not seeing a score improvement. I'm just like bombarding myself with this test and didn't see my score improve. And now that I'm like realizing that there's sort of this fundamental approach to every question type, and that it's so variant that like knowing the pattern before you see the pattern is absolutely essential. So yeah, I would love seeing the question types broken. And I haven't, I mean, like, I think you wrote in one of your blog posts that it'd be impossible to like label all of the question types by category and then put them all on a list and then have you do them completely. But have you done that? Is that what you're suggesting, or that you have?
Well, there's a lot of different ways one can categorize, right? And the LSAT, you're right. It's too complex an exam to just throw yourself into the deep end of the pool with full length exams when they're all different types, all scrambled together. Especially in logical reasoning, that's where there's the most scrambling, because you have the greatest number of question types and methods of reasoning and just general complexity, in my view. But to answer your question, there's question stem categorizations, which are fairly normal in the LSAT prep world. Then there's also method of reasoning categorizations, which, to my knowledge, nobody's done, because there are too many methods of reasoning and it would take too long to create them, given how many LSAT questions there are. And how you define method of reasoning is also a pretty complicated thing. But question stems are fairly simple and straightforward overall. There's, by most counts, there's somewhere between 12 to 15 major categories of question stem types. And so I have them categorized like that by question stem type. I also have, within sufficient assumptions specifically, subcategorizations. There's that restatement and broadening category. There's also the category you referenced, where we're providing a new conditional statement that, in combination with the evidence, guarantees the conclusion. So in my walkthrough in the workshop, as you said, C requires A is the new proposed sufficient assumption, and A requires B is the initial given evidence. And the two of those conditionals combined give you C requires B. This is one of the most common sufficient assumption formats. And so I have a big list of sufficient assumption questions that follow that format. So you can practice seeing how to extract that underlying formal logic from the conditional statements you're given in the stimulus.
Okay, perfect. I had another question.
Sure.
So, I mean, depending on how much my score increases between now and in the next few months, ideally, I'd like to take the June flex. Do you recommend following your 3-month study plan for that, or should I tailor it in a different way? Just granted that I have sort of experience with the fundamentals, I have experience with a lot of practice tests. How do you think I should go about that? Or should I postpone maybe when I take the LSAT?
Well, I would definitely tailor it. I mean, you got to reflect where you're at. And so any of the general study plan templates are going to assume no prior knowledge starting from the beginning. And that's not where you are. You've noted, it sounds like logical reasoning, overthinking easy questions, and then sufficient assumptions. So you might give it more of a logical reasoning focus. And we haven't discussed games or reading comp, although we can, and that might reveal some areas to focus too. But if you already have taken a lot of exams and you feel like you have a good sense of the fundamentals overall, then a lot of your work, maybe not. I mean, a lot of it could just be doing exams and reviewing. But if you're feeling iffy on certain fundamentals, maybe you want to watch some of the foundational videos in the course, or watch some of the workshops in the course and attend if you have access. And that might help you to shore up those weak areas.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't know, like, because I mean, I've taken the LSAT before, and I tried to improve, and I wasn't improving. But now that I'm like doing that review that you recommended, where you transform the stimulus into different types, I'm suddenly seeing like, okay, I'm rapidly, I can see I'm exponentially improving, quite literally. But I'm afraid that June, maybe I'm not improving my score as much as I could, with maybe more study time and taking the August LSAT, but that comes at the cost of having an added section. And then that sort of has with it like a new, like adaption. Like I'll have to have more endurance as opposed to the 3-section one. Are there any, is there a trade-off between those two that you'd recommend, maybe with like a high, if I score like X amount, like an X amount increase in or like by June compared to like an X amount increase by August, or how would you approach that?
That's a great question. It's a situation I think a lot of people are going to find themselves in as June gets closer and they consider going for August instead. So I'm glad you're thinking about it now because it's a valid question and you could take either one and still apply at the very beginning of the cycle. So there's not even a cost in terms of admissions timelines. And there wouldn't be a big cost even if it did affect when you applied. Like August 1st, October also wouldn't be a big deal to apply a little bit later. But you're right that this particular decision relates to that fourth section, the unscored, unknown, experimental. How much does it matter? Personally, I don't think it has to matter that much, although I can understand nobody wanting to do it naturally. So my challenge to you would be, could you improve enough during an additional 2 months of studying to make it worth the while?
Yeah, that's the thing. And I feel like I really could. And I feel like there's sort of like diminishing return, or at least from what I've experienced, diminishing returns. Like the more, I could be wrong on this. It was probably my approach, but when I first started studying, I saw a dramatic increase. And then as I studied more in the months that followed, my score started dropping. And I don't know if I was exhausted from taking so many tests and things just weren't sticking, or it just had to do with like my acquaintance with the test. But like, I feel like nailing the fundamentals now, suddenly I'm going to have all these gaps closed for me. And that 3-section test will be, I hope, flawless, and not having to deal with the stamina for a 4-section one and adapting to that. So I'm not even taking a practice test. I mean, maybe you would recommend differently. But I feel like I've done enough practice tests that I don't need to do one until maybe like a few weeks out from the actual test. Would you say that that's good or bad?
I would mix them in throughout. It sounds like what you experienced before may have been burnout. It sounds pretty likely to me, actually. If your scores are dropping as you study more, something's not working. So I can understand if you want to take a break from that, but I would want you mixing those in pretty frequently.
Okay.
So I wouldn't want you to do 0 of them between now and even August. I mean, that's a long time away. Yeah. I'd want you mixing them in regularly. And if you decide to go for August, then I would suggest, of course, taking them in that format too, 4-section.
Okay. And then how often, because I noticed in your 3-month study plan, you have days that should be taken off. Would you recommend, like, is that like a day? I mean, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. I mean, granted that I already have like experience with the test, do you recommend maybe having like, should I be taking time sections every day, or should I be taking days off? Because I feel like I can like manage a day where like I have maybe like 50% less study time, but I don't have diminishing returns by studying. How would you go about, or how often do you think I should take time sections versus the regular LSAT versus just an overview, maybe studying notes and watching foundational videos and these things?
I'm curious about the motivation, because I get the sense that you want to do a lot.
Yeah, that's accurate.
So if you were to go for August and you had 5 months between now and then, do you think you need to study every day? And do you think you will study every day?
I think I will completely. I mean, I will probably burn myself out come August, which is what I'm nervous about. Is that I know that suddenly the stress will come in, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna do like 6 hours today, and it's gonna kill me in the long run. So I feel like I don't know. I'm really sort of at odds with whether or not. I mean, the June is obviously, like I said, it's shorter. It's going to be. I mean, I know they say it's not easier, but I feel like it will be easier for me just knowing that there's not an extra section that I have to devote mental energy to. But I also get test anxiety, so maybe the 4-section one will benefit me knowing that maybe the fourth one isn't an experimental one and my nerves sort of decrease as I'm taking the test or something. But
I mean, a possible benefit of the experimental section is that you don't do well on something. You could say, hey, maybe it was the experimental section that doesn't count anyway.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
One possible benefit that might serve to relieve some of the anxiety that you could experience. I'm sure you don't need to study every single day. You could take a day off and be fine. And let's be realistic about it. I mean, anything could happen to the point where, like, let's say on a 5-month timeline, like, let's say maybe you get sick one day, maybe you have the chance to go out of town a little bit for a day or for a weekend or something. Maybe you have a family obligation, or maybe you just deserve a day off. You know what? Like, maybe you just deserve a day off where you could take it easy a little bit and do something else. I mean, COVID's been a pretty rough time for most people, I think. And I think that just being home, being on devices a lot, like, you could go to the park, right? I mean, depending on the weather, I mean, it's possible to just get out a little bit and do something else for a change of pace. And that could clear your mind a little bit.
Okay. It just feels like when I'm not studying, I feel like I'm wasting time. But I mean, that's clearly not the reality. It's actually probably beneficial to step away and then have your mind like readapt.
Is there anything productive you could be doing that isn't LSAT prep?
Yes. I mean, I work full time actually. So like, I feel like my time is like very limited as far as like what I can be devoting to the LSAT. And I try and study like early in the morning for like an hour, and then maybe like 2 hours after work, and then into the evening, maybe if I can squeeze like 2 more hours in. But typically as the day goes on, I just get progressively worse. My focus and energy is just scattered. But before I started working full time, I was devoting like my full day to just studying. So maybe it comes from that past that I feel like I like when I was in that zone, I was just like, oh yes, I'm completely focused. I have no other obligations. I'm just LSAT, just master this, and I'm the king of the world. But so
I hear that. I mean, you can get there. I believe you can get there by June. I believe you can get there by August. And I think allowing more time always helps. It helps to a point as long as you're not obsessing over it, which I see is certainly a possibility. I can relate myself, as you could imagine. Now,
yeah.
But if you're working full time, at least that will serve as some check on LSAT prep, where it will limit you during those hours. You can't be doing LSAT very much, I'd imagine. But the reason I brought up doing productive things is because I'm also that way, where like I have a hard time doing something that I view as not productive at all. I always want to be working towards a goal and be tracking something in some way to know I'm making forward progress. And so we can try to fight that, or we can see what can you do to channel it in another direction. Like, for example, the admissions side. Even the admissions side is something that will help you on this whole law school journey that isn't doing multiple choice problems. So personal statement, other application essays, where are you on those?
So I applied actually for this cycle, but I know my score can improve. Actually, I scored in the lower bound of what I had been scoring in on average. So I just decided to apply because I just thought, why not? I mean, maybe there was a downside, but I figured, well, if this is enough just to get into a school that I like, then I'll go in. But it hasn't been favorable, unfortunately. So I will be retaking it. So maybe, I mean, I don't know, how much would you say that I should devote to doing that early? I mean, I don't know how much I should change my personal statement. I haven't actually reached out to any of the admission counselors with regards to like my application. Would you recommend doing that?
You could follow up simply to indicate interest.
Even to a school that I wasn't admitted to?
I thought you were referencing those that you haven't heard back from.
Yeah. I guess, those as well. But what about the ones like that I wasn't admitted to, but maybe I could ask for, like, would they be open to giving like comments or sort of why they rejected you? Is that something that's doable?
They often don't want to do that. because
Really?
it just opens up a whole conversation that they don't really want to have. I mean, they're getting so many applications that they can't give detailed feedback in that way, especially over email.
Okay.
For email, I'd say you're not likely to hear anything on that. But what you could do is reach out, set up a discussion, expressing interest in the school, and indicating that you want, when you ask for this, say that you indicate that you want to reapply.
Okay.
And say that, and then during that conversation, you can talk about, what might I be able to do to increase my odds for next time around? And that could relate to things like typically your LSAT score. So they might say something like, okay, your LSAT was this before, but if you can get at least this score instead, which might be bumping it up however many number of points, then that could make you a much stronger candidate. So at least you can get a sense of where you're at, but they're not going to say, listen, like your personal statement sucked or your resume wasn't strong enough. They're not going to tell you things like that. Yeah. So I'd say get a higher LSAT, improve your personal statement, maybe clean up some language in your resume if you can. We have workshops in the course covering this stuff, by the way. We have application essay workshops. We have admission sessions. Every single week there's something going on.
Okay,
so you can benefit from those
I
too.
have seen those. Yeah. I haven't clicked just because I 100% LSAT mode at the moment, but I guess it's never too early to get a head start.
Yeah, and that's something you can do on the side that's productive, that will still help you on this journey. It's not like you want to revise your personal statement in one night and then hit submit after you've already taken the LSAT. This is something to be thinking about on the side. In parallel, maybe not the same number of hours each week, of course, but to devote some small percentage of time each week to something admissions related to help move you forward on that path too.
Right. Okay.
And that might be as simple as watching a video related to it to just gain some more knowledge about that side of the process so that when you do interact with admissions, you have a better sense of how to do it.
Okay. Another question I wanted to ask was I'll just tell you my score outright that I had recently. I had a 156. And like I said, I know I can score better than that, but say I don't score better, or I have the hunch that I didn't score better and I want to cancel it. I guess that my first question is, how would that affect my actual application from the perspective of an admissions officer? And then second, how much would you recommend that I increase by to actually, post that score and have it serve as my score for my application?
It doesn't matter.
Really?
It really doesn't matter. I mean, schools don't average multiple scores. So a lower score versus a cancellation, it really makes no difference at all.
Really? Okay. That really clears the air on a lot of things, because I guess Reddit is very misleading in many ways, but people are like, oh yeah, no, you shouldn't take it more than twice. And
geez, no way. Terrible advice. Terrible.
You take it 3 times, they average all the scores, and I'm like, oh my gosh, am I done? Have I just destroyed my chances? So that's very reassuring.
No, I wouldn't spend time. I mean, listen, Reddit's a great community. I actually created the law school admissions subreddit a long time ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. I don't spend a lot of time in that world anymore, but random people can say anything they want. And I think they're typically well-meaning, but they just are ill-informed. And so there are quality posters on there. Definitely look at their history, look at who they are. There are some quality experts on there, but there's also a lot of people who don't have any idea what they're talking about or are going off of just outdated information. Law schools used to average multiple scores pre-2006. A lot of websites out there are still not up to date, even though we're 15 years later. So take that stuff with a heavy grain of salt. And since you're in the course, just use the course stuff. Ask questions. You know what I mean? There's ways to get more vetted information. And I've done plenty of discussions with current and former admission officers talking about these kinds of things too.
Okay. All right. So if you think that if I improve my score significantly this time, on the practice test, definitely take it. Or even if it's a marginal difference, or I think that I can improve somewhat, I should still take it.
I recommend retaking by default, which is a little bit controversial, but
Okay.
Hear me out a little bit. The idea is that because schools don't average multiple scores, through luck alone, you could do a few points better.
Right.
So
Okay.
why wouldn't you aim to hit the high end of your range if on a previous take you were simply hitting your average? And I mean, you're doing a significant amount of studying since last time you took it regardless. So it's hard to see how your score wouldn't improve if your understanding is increasing. And then you're also dealing with test day anxiety, simulating test day, keeping up with your practice tests. I can always see room for improvement regardless. I mean, you scored 156 before and you put in dozens of hours, hundreds of hours between that take and your next one, and you reapply with a stronger personal statement and other application essays too, your odds overall for admission should be significantly higher. But if your practice tests are in, let's say you get by June, you get to the mid 160s at least. Let's say by August, you get to the low 170s at least. There's no question you should take it. I mean, you're not going to do as low as a 156 given how much you've improved along that way.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that advice.
Of course. And by the way, even if I just made up those increases, even if those increases are half of what I proposed that they might be, it'd still be worth it. If you could retake, if your practice test average was still a 156, which it's not going to be, and your higher end was a 160, why wouldn't you retake it and apply with a 160?
Mm-hmm.
In my view, there's no scenario where it wouldn't make sense if your understanding is improving and your practice test scores are improving.
Right. Okay. Okay, perfect. We cleared the air on a lot of things. Trying to think of I definitely had another question. Oh, okay. I know you said that like to sort of like supplement your understanding and like the attack on reading comprehension, you should read like The Economist and like The Atlantic and those things. Should I keep like my like reading regiment to like those difficult texts, or like is there a trade-off by reading, say, like a novel? Like I knew you're gonna say like, oh no, there's, of course you can like read a novel if you want to read a novel, but is there like sort of like a slow drifting towards like a certain mindset if you're reading like longer passages that aren't of the length of a reading comprehension?
I get what you're saying. I mean, your life can't be nothing but the LSAT for 3 months, 5 months, whatever. You've got to have time away. You've got to have breaks.
Yeah.
You don't need to watch, like, let's say like a film buff doesn't need to only watch classic films or documentaries. It's okay to like relax with Game of Thrones or something, or like a reality show. It's not going to automatically make you dumber to do something light. So reading a novel is okay. And that novel doesn't have to be like a classic work of literature. It could be beach reading. It could be a Pulp Fiction of some kind. It could be something light. That's totally fine. It's a different mindset naturally. You don't need to read novels with critical analysis or characters and that sort of thing. You can just read it as something light to enjoy. I wouldn't consider that LSAT related unless it had a tough vocabulary, but it's still fine to do it.
Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, I don't really have any more questions. You answered them all.
No, of course. I'm glad to help. I'm glad we connected. Keep in touch and reach out if you need anything at all. I'm happy to help.
Yeah. Actually, I do have another question though.
Yeah, sure.
I saw like on the side where you had like different course times and things. How often do you guys do like deep dives where you're actually looking at like passages and breaking them down?
If you're talking about reading comp passages,
or passages, or any other like question types.
I mean, there's multiple sections happening every week. So we've got games, we have reasoning, we have reading comp. There's recurring weekly class times covering all of those. There's a reading comp deep dive class tonight. There's 2 logical reasoning classes back to back on Thursday. There's logic games tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
So attend and join any of them, or join all of them if you can. I mean, I don't want you to join all of them if it would cause you to burn out.
Okay.
But you have access to them, and I would encourage you to attend as many as you feel able without going overboard on it.
Okay.
And they're all recorded too if you miss one.
Okay.
They're all recorded. They're all uploaded to the course later.
Okay, perfect. Well, it was really nice meeting you, Steve.
Of course, it was great connecting with you. Keep at it. reach out if you need anything, and I'll see you in class soon. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.